I didn't know Dr. King, but what he did and what he did for me and what he did for us changed my life. I came into the Army at a time when segregation was still in the land, although the Army had integrated. But we had this dichotomy between being on an Army post where I was open and being in Columbus, Georgia, where I was prejudiced, where people threw me out of a hamburger joint after I came back from my first tour in Vietnam and had been injured. And all I wanted was a hamburger, and they wouldn't serve me. But it was Dr. King and his efforts, beginning from the 1955 period, the Montgomery bus boycott, all the way through his death in 1968. It was his efforts that not only freed blacks, it freed Americans, it freed whites. It took a burden off the white people of the United States and took a burden off the black people. So it was something he did for all of America, and that's what made his contribution so significant. And even though I couldn't participate in that because I was an active duty officer going to Vietnam twice during that period and also serving elsewhere, I followed it. Every time I went to Vietnam, I left my wife and infant children back in Birmingham, Alabama. And in 1963, Birmingham, Alabama was not a very nice place. It had riots, Bull Connor and his dogs. And my father-in-law spent his time guarding my family while I was in Vietnam serving the nation. And all that changed. Now, Dr. King's legacy is a real one. We've got a lot more to do. We've got a long way to go. But I'm sitting here as a son of an immigrant family, black kid, public school education, was able to rise to the top. And the way that was made for me was built a large extent by what Dr. King did and by his great sacrifice. When he was murdered on April 4th, 1968, I was at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas in training, getting ready to go back to Vietnam. And I'll never forget the shock that went through our community. And I'll never forget the image of buses being put around the White House, bumper to bumper, to protect the White House from the outraged citizens in Washington, D.C. And so he will never be forgotten. The only thing I was able to do later in life was to be on the council that helped build a new monument to Dr. King. But he had an indelible impression upon America, and he should always be treasured for that. And we should all pause and reflect on the contributions he's made on this 50th anniversary of his passing. It's hard to tell what the next 50 years will be like, because I couldn't tell you 50 years ago what today would be like. It would have been unthinkable for me to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or Secretary of State. But the trend I see is that America is becoming a more mosaic nation. By that I mean you see intermarriages, you see tolerance of marriages that you would not have seen to be tolerant just a few years ago. So I think America, by the year 2043, will find that the minorities of Americans are now the majority of Americans. And we're the only nation in the world who can handle this kind of demographic change. And I'm confident as I watch television, and kind of don't pay attention to the wild stuff that's said, but watch television, more and more I see acceptance of this kind of change in our demographics. And I hope that 50 years from now, we will all be, again, one people, one nation under God, as our founding fathers told us we should be. And that is my hope, and I think it's Dr. King's hope. If he was still alive, he would be beating up everybody to do the right thing. He would not have given up. Remember, he died just after going to the service of garbage men in Memphis. The whole nation was carrying the burden of discrimination and Jim Crowism. It was holding blacks down, but it was also holding whites down. They knew better. They knew this was wrong. They knew that the Emancipation Proclamation and Abraham Lincoln, what he did, the Civil War, they knew that was the way to go. But for many years after that, throughout the rest of that century, blacks were again subjected. There were slaves once again, even if there was not legal slavery. And so the story I always like to tell is the hamburger joint I got thrown out of after I came back from Vietnam, was looking for a place for my family to live. I just went in for a hamburger. I knew I was in a segregated city, and she wouldn't serve me. But I went back to that same hamburger joint on July 4th, 1964, right after the Civil Rights Accommodation Act had been signed. And I asked for my hamburger, and they said, "Yes, sir." And they handed me my hamburger. She didn't want to discriminate against me, and we removed that burden off of her. I could go into a store now and try on clothes. All the signs that used to exist all over the South, anywhere below Washington, D.C., would have 3 signs over the 3 restrooms in a gas station. Black, and then white men, white women, blacks. Gone. All gone. You couldn't find any of those in the country now. And so they were suffering too. There are still some of them who think, well, we should go, a little bit backwards. No, we've got to keep going forward. But it's a challenge and it's a struggle, and all of us have to fight this struggle to make sure that all of our fellow citizens, not just blacks, but Indians, Hispanics, and anybody else you can think of, is treated equally and gets just results from their work, their education, and their belief in this great country of ours. I think we've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go. We see every day problems that exist in our country, but at the same time, I see great things that have happened in our country. I see a black mayor in Plano, Texas, something you never would have thought would happen. I've seen immigrants rising to top positions. I see people of color who are very, very wealthy in the stock market. I see people of color and different backgrounds, different sources of their coming to the United States, doing very, very well and moving up. So you can't say that it's all been a failure. What it has been is great success, but success doesn't end. You have to keep going after it. You have to keep finding where the problems are, where the discrimination is, and doing something about it. And what I think Dr. King will be focusing on right now is the people who are the poorest in our land, who do not have the education they need, who are not living in the kind of family units that they really need, and who need jobs. Ultimately, the solution to all problems associated with our nation, I think, is to get everybody an education and a job and put them in a family unit that can bring the children up, raise the children, and teach children who know how to mind their manners and mind their adults. And that's what it's all about.